welcome to the debate. I mean, picture this. You've spent weeks just tearing through a company's financials.
Oh, yeah. Endless spreadsheets.
Right, you're an accounting student or maybe a junior professional, and you finally nailed it. The balance sheet is flawless.
Yep.
The debits and credits align perfectly. It's almost like engineering, you know? You look at that spreadsheet, you point to the bottom line, and you have this tremendous comfort because the truth is right there. In black and white, it's objective.
Right. It's completely binary. I mean, it balances or it doesn't. And human beings, especially people who are drawn to the accounting profession, we just love that certainty.
We really do.
We love things that can be neatly categorized, locked into rigid rows and columns, and entirely contained. Because, well, the math doesn't judge you.
Exactly. The math doesn't judge. But then, and this is where it all falls apart, you have to step into the boardroom.
Ugh, the dreaded boardroom.
Or you have to stand up in a university classroom. Suddenly, you actually have to open your mouth and speak about those numbers to a room full of senior partners.
Or intimidating professors.
Yeah, and that's terrifying.
And in that moment, all that precise, comforting machinery just completely breaks down. We're no longer dealing with objective math. We're dealing with human anxiety, and it's incredibly murky.
It really is. The numbers on the page remain objective, sure, but the act of communicating them becomes a deeply subjective, terrifying experience for so many people.
Your heart races, your mind goes blank.
Total panic.
Right. It's a massive hurdle that derails incredibly talented people before their careers even really begin.
It is, and today we're bringing you a special edition for pod accounting, which is an activity of the Programa de Pós-Graduation in Ciências Contábeis da UFPE. We are diving into a really fascinating piece of research that maps out exactly why this anxiety happens.
And, well, before we get into the actual mechanisms of that fear, we have to introduce the researchers who mapped out this psychological terrain.
Definitely.
So the author of the study is Bruno Luis do Nascimento Silva Santos. The research was guided by his advisor, Daniel Joseph Cardoso da Silva.
Right.
Alongside his co-advisor, Fabio Albuquerque. And we should mention, Fabio Albuquerque is actually a professor at ISCAO in Lisbon, Portugal.
Yeah, a great cross-continental team. And this work actually originated as a 2020 master's thesis, right?
Yes, it did.
Before being expanded and officially published in an academic journal in 2023. The study we are exploring today is titled A Cultural Approach to Oral Communication Apprehension by Accounting Students in Brazil and Portugal.
Published in 2023.
Exactly. And the central question here goes right to the heart of professional development. Like, what is the fundamental root of a student's fear of speaking up? So today, we're going to analyze the influence of power distance, specifically according to Geert Hofstede's cultural model, on oral communication apprehension among these accounting students.
It's a profound question. And, as always, we're going to come at it from two very different perspectives today.
We are. Because I'm going to argue that it's society's broad cultural programming, specifically how much that culture tolerates unequal power distribution, which Hofstede calls power distance, is the foundational blueprint. It is the primary, fundamental driver for a student's communication anxiety.
And I'll be taking the stance that while abstract cultural models like Hofstede's are, theoretically interesting, the true overriding drivers of this apprehension are immediate. They are tangible sociodemographic realities.
Like what?
I'm talking about gender roles, age, and the localized environment of the classroom itself. I argue these exert a much more direct influence that broad cultural dimensions just completely fail to capture.
Okay, well, let's jump right into the mechanism of this. My perspective is rooted in the empirical findings of the research. They use two highly validated psychological instruments here.
The PRCA-24 and the CV scale, right?
Exactly. One measures communication apprehension. Basically, do you just get a few butterflies, or do you experience a full-on panic response where you literally refuse to speak?
Right.
And the other instrument measures individual power distance, meaning how much do you internally accept that a boss or a professor is fundamentally above you? And the paper shows a clear statistical link. Students who have a higher perception of power distance also have a significantly higher level of communication apprehension.
I see the link. The data is the data. But I think we really need to unpack what that actually means in practice.
Well, think about culture the way Hofstede defines it. He calls it the collective programming of the mind.
The software.
Right, it's the software we're all running without even knowing it. I argue that this programming creates an invisible architectural framework of hierarchy. If you grow up in a culture with a high power distance index, you are fundamentally conditioned from childhood to expect that decision-making is centralized. You're taught that subordinates should never bypass superiors, that absolute obedience is a virtue. So when that junior accountant feels terrified to speak to a senior partner, it's not just a situational stage fright.
You think it's deeper?
Way deeper. It's a deeply culturally programmed apprehension. They feel like speaking out of turn isn't just awkward, it's practically a violation of the social order. Power distance is the preceding element. It sets the stage for the fear.
I come at it from a completely different way. I mean, I certainly respect the data here. They gathered hundreds of valid responses across Brazil and Portugal. They filtered out a lot of noise to find these correlations.
Right. Robust data.
And yes, power distance shows up as statistically relevant. I won't deny that. But if you look closely, the most compelling, actionable evidence in this paper points straight towards sociodemographic variables and the immediate environment.
How so?
Look at the cross-country stability. The study found remarkably similar results across both Brazil and Portugal. I mean, the levels of apprehension and the levels of power distance were nearly identical.
Yes, they were.
Now, Portugal and Brazil have vastly different modern economic contexts, different geographical realities, different day-to-day modern societal structures. To me, this stability suggests that universal human dynamics in academic settings override abstract national culture.
You think it's just the classroom itself?
Exactly. It's the localized accounting environment that's the problem. When we look purely at something broad like national power distance, we risk completely ignoring the tangible, localized social realities that silence specific groups in that specific room. The immediate environment is the architect of the anxiety.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on that exact same cross-country stability. You look at the similarities between the Brazilian and Portuguese students, and you see proof that national culture doesn't matter, that it's just a universal academic problem. Well, I look at those identical scores and see absolute proof of the cultural hypothesis.
Wait, how does identical scores in two completely different countries prove a national cultural theory?
Because they share a cultural DNA. The paper explicitly notes the colonial heritage that links these two nations. We're talking about historical roots dating back to the 16th century, initiated by the sugarcane plantation cycles in the 1530s in the Brazilian Northeast.
Okay, but
This wasn't just a brief interaction. This was a centuries-long relationship that forged profound shared institutional and social symmetries regarding hierarchy. They literally built their concepts of authority, bureaucracy, and social stratification together.
But that was 500 years ago. Are we really blaming the 1500s for a 22-year-old stage fright today?
Yes, because culture moves slowly. It's intergenerational. The fact that the power distance index averages were so incredibly close and that both groups hovered right around the same moderate to high levels of communication apprehension is not a coincidence. It is evidence that this shared cultural programming, transmitted from parents to children over centuries, dictates how we relate to authority today. The stability across these two specific countries actually proves that underlying culture is the variable holding the behavior together.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that leap. Let me tell you why. You are using a 500-year-old colonial plantation history to explain away the identical psychological reactions of a modern 20-something university student in Recife and a modern 20-something university student in Lisbon.
It's the root of it, yes.
But if power distance is truly this defining, sensitive cultural metric that deeply dictates human behavior, shouldn't we expect far more variance between two countries operating in entirely different modern realities? I mean, Portugal is integrated into the European Union. Brazil has a completely different modern socio-political and economic landscape.
But the foundational views on authority remain.
But think about the actual day-to-day life of those students. If their anxiety results are exactly the same, isn't it much more logically sound to conclude that the academic accounting environment itself is simply triggering a universal human anxiety?
I don't think it's universal, though.
The modern accounting classroom, with its incredibly rigorous grading, its intense emphasis on absolute right or wrong answers, and a highly formalized student-teacher dynamic is a pressure cooker. That environment creates the apprehension.
Relying on 16th century colonial heritage feels like we're trying to force the modern data to fit Hofstede's broad theory, rather than letting the localized data speak for itself.
The data is speaking for itself, though, and it's doing it through how they measured this. They used an instrument that removes broad national stereotypes and measures the individual's perception of culture.
The CV scale.
Right. It's not just saying, oh, Brazilians act like X or Portuguese act like Y. It is literally measuring how deeply the specific student sitting in that specific chair has internalized the belief that people in higher positions shouldn't ask the opinions of people in lower positions.
Okay, and when the researchers ran the numbers, whether they looked at the total group or just Brazil or just Portugal, that internal acceptance of power inequality was positively significantly related to their fear of speaking. You can't dismiss the cultural through line when the correlation between internal hierarchy and external fear is staring us right in the face across both populations.
Okay, I am not dismissing the math at all. The correlation is absolutely there. What I'm challenging is the hierarchy of importance. I think you're looking at the background radiation, but completely missing the immediate hazard. Let's pivot to a very specific, undeniable demographic reality in this data: the gender divide.
Okay, let's talk about gender.
The study found that female students have considerably higher levels of oral communication apprehension than male students. The gap is significant. Yet, paradoxically, the male students exhibited greater individual power distance.
Right. The men were more accepting of hierarchical inequality, but less anxious about speaking.
Exactly. And that proves my point perfectly. If your theory was the whole story, the people with the highest power distance, the men, should be the most terrified to speak to authority. But they aren't.
Well,
The women are more anxious, even though they are generally less accepting of the unequal power dynamic. This shows that anxiety here isn't just about internally respecting authority or culturally programmed power distance. It is about structural realities.
how so?
The text cites Lehman's 1992 work, noting that societal norms are directly reflected in the accounting profession. Historically, women's access to higher positions in this field has been severely restricted.
Right, the glass ceiling.
Exactly. And research by Daly and Miller shows that women face a tangibly higher risk of being interrupted, discredited, or outright silenced in professional settings. Imagine a 22-year-old female junior accountant spotting a math error made by a 50-year-old male senior partner in a boardroom.
It's a tough spot.
Her fear of speaking up isn't because she culturally believes he is an infallible superior. Her fear is based on the very real, localized demographic reality that if she speaks up, she is more likely to be talked over or penalized than her male peers. The immediate environment is imposing the anxiety independent of Hofstede's cultural programming.
That's a really compelling scenario. I'll give you that. Though I would frame the underlying mechanics of it entirely differently. You're presenting gender as if it exists in a vacuum, completely separate from culture. But I view this through the analogy of a cultural ecosystem.
A cultural ecosystem? Explain what you mean by that in this context.
Well, the paper actually links these gender differences to another one of Hofstede's primary cultural dimensions, masculinity versus femininity. In this framework, dominant masculine cultural traits involve competitiveness, self-fulfillment, financial success, and material achievement.
Okay.
The accounting profession historically was built entirely around these masculine societal norms. So gender dynamics aren't an alternative to culture, they are just another expression of the overarching culture.
But how does that explain her specific anxiety in that boardroom?
Because women are experiencing higher apprehension precisely because they are operating within a systemic ecosystem that is culturally coded as masculine. The friction happens when you place someone into a cultural environment built for someone else. This actually validates the idea that culture is the ultimate architect of our behavior.
I see what you're saying, but
Eustense and masculinity are intersecting cultural vectors. You cannot separate the localized demographic reality of that boardroom from the broader cultural soil in which that boardroom was originally built.
it's an elegant theory, sure, but have you considered the real-world danger of that ecosystem analogy?
Danger? Danger in what sense?
Well, if we write off gender disparity as just a natural expression of overarching cultural masculinity, we abstract away the actual harm. We make it seem inevitable. We make it about Geert Hofstede's grand dimensions rather than about a specific classroom dynamic where a female student is literally being spoken over by a male peer today.
I'm not saying it's inevitable.
But the sociodemographic reality is the actual mechanism of action. Furthermore, the data shows that this apprehension persists despite the woman's individual view on power distance. She might entirely reject the unequal division of power. She might have a very low power distance score, but she is still terrified to speak because the immediate social environment is penalizing her. The environment is actively generating the anxiety, not her internal programming.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores the mechanism of how culture operates on the individual. Culture is the unwritten rules of the game.
Right, but
Wait, let me finish. If a student with a low individual power distance, someone who wants an egalitarian workplace, steps into a highly traditional high power distance accounting firm, the friction between her internal beliefs and the external cultural reality is precisely what generates the severe apprehension. It's a clash of software.
okay.
But let's actually test your theory about the immediate environment by looking at what I think is the most fascinating finding in the entire paper: the paradox of age versus experience.
I am so glad you brought that up because this is where the data gets incredibly revealing.
It really does. So when the researchers filtered out all the noise, they found that older age statistically decreases communication apprehension. As a student's literal age goes up, their fear of speaking goes down.
Which makes total sense.
Right. But here is the catch. When they looked at the student's academic stage, meaning are you a freshman or a senior, or whether the student had actual professional work experience in an accounting firm, neither of those things significantly reduced their apprehension. Let that sink in for a second.
It's wild.
Merely advancing through the academic system for 4 years, or even getting a job and working in the field, does not make you more comfortable speaking up.
It's a striking finding. I totally agree.
And I argue this absolutely proves the cultural hypothesis. Think about it. The specific power distance environment of accounting academia and practice is so deeply entrenched, so culturally rigid, that mere exposure to it doesn't cure your anxiety. A senior is just as culturally suppressed as a freshman. Only general life maturity, literally just getting older and gaining broader life perspective outside that specific accounting subculture, reduces the apprehension. You don't outgrow the fear by learning more accounting. You outgrow it by learning more about life.
I agree completely with the data points you just laid out, but I flip the conclusion entirely.
How can you flip that? It literally shows the environment doesn't help them.
Exactly. And if advancing in the coursework and gaining professional experience do not lower a student's communication apprehension, that completely shatters the idea that they are simply internalizing a comfortable cultural norm.
Wait, how?
Because if power distance was truly just a collective programming of the mind, a native software they were comfortable running, they would adapt to it. They would settle into their defined hierarchical role as they advanced. A senior would know the rules of the game and feel way less anxious playing it.
But the hierarchy keeps them anxious.
No, the environment keeps them anxious. As the paper points out, citing Fu and colleagues from 2015, the social environment of accounting remains completely conducive to communication apprehension regardless of how far you advance. This shows that the localized environment, the specific classroom, the specific accounting firm's culture, is the root problem.
I disagree.
The hierarchy isn't a peaceful cultural blueprint they accept. It is an externally imposed threat that constantly intimidates them.
But again,
Let me just finish this thought. The fact that only age, which brings general human confidence completely independent of the accounting environment, lowers anxiety, proves that the students are reacting to an objectively stressful immediate reality. When you get older, you start to realize the hierarchy is just constructed by the people in the room. You realize the senior partner is just a guy. That's a demographic, localized realization, not a shift in national culture.
Okay, but if the localized environment is the sole driver, why does the CV scale, the tool that measures the individual's acceptance of power inequality, predict their level of apprehension so reliably. The researchers controlled for age, they controlled for gender.
Right.
They controlled for stage in the course and for work experience. And even when all those sociodemographic variables are stripped away and accounted for, the power distance index remains positively and significantly correlated with the apprehension score.
I don't deny the correlation.
If the correlation holds, it means the higher their internal acceptance of power distance, the higher their anxiety. That means the apprehension is an internal cognitive process dictated by their cultural values, not just a reaction to an externally imposed threat. Think about the mechanics of it. If you genuinely culturally believe your boss should not consult you, you will inherently feel more panic when you are suddenly forced to speak to them. You feel like you're breaking the rules of the universe. That is cultural programming in its purest form.
Listen, I don't deny the statistical correlation, but correlation is not causation. A student who scores incredibly high on a power distance survey might be doing so precisely because they have been beaten down by a localized environment that demands absolute obedience.
Oh, interesting.
Their high score isn't their native 500-year-old cultural blueprint. It is a survival mechanism. They adopted it after interacting with the specific rigid hierarchy of their university or their first internship.
So you think the apprehension causes the power distance rather than the other way around?
I think they feed each other in a localized loop. But my broader point is about how we actually fix this. If we want to solve oral communication apprehension, which is a massive hurdle for future professionals, we can't just throw our hands up and say, well, it's the Portuguese or Brazilian cultural heritage. It's 500 years of Hofstede's collective programming.
Right, we can't change history.
Exactly, we can't fix that. What we can fix are the immediate demographics and the room dynamics. We have to look at why a 20-year-old female junior feels silenced today, and we have to fix the way professors grade participation or the way partners run meetings.
And I would counter that you cannot possibly fix those boardroom or classroom dynamics without profoundly understanding the cultural water in which those students are swimming. If you try to apply a purely demographic fix, like just changing the seating arrangement or mandating participation to a problem that is deeply rooted in a society's multi-generational relationship with authority, you are just treating a symptom.
You think it's a Band-Aid?
It is. You aren't curing the disease. The true value of this research by Santos Silva and Albuquerque is that it proves mathematically that we must integrate cultural awareness into how we train future accountants. We have to teach them how to navigate their own cultural programming.
Well, we are nearing the end of our time, and while we clearly approach the interpretation of this data from completely opposing angles, I think we have reached a really vital point of convergence today.
I agree. We definitely have. Both of us, and indeed the authors of the study, acknowledge that oral communication apprehension is a critical, tangible barrier. It's not just a soft skill issue, it's a professional crisis for future accounting professionals.
Absolutely.
The data firmly proves a link between hierarchical environments, gender dynamics, and student anxiety. Whether we are looking at a classroom in Brazil or a lecture hall in Portugal, a moderate to high level of fear is deeply embedded in the process of communicating financial information.
It really is. The convergence is clear. For a modern accountant, the numbers alone are just not enough. The ability to communicate those numbers to clients, to managers, to the public, without debilitating anxiety, is an absolute professional necessity.
Exactly.
And currently, the system we have is actively fostering apprehension. Where we diverge, and where we leave our listeners to ponder, is the lens through which we view the ultimate solution. I maintain that broad cultural frameworks, like Hofstede's power distance, provide the foundational understanding necessary to decode this fear. You simply cannot change a deeply ingrained behavior until you understand the collective programming of the mind that engineered it in the first place.
And I leave the listener to consider whether tackling the immediate demographic and contextual inequities provides a clearer, more actionable path forward. By focusing on the localized realities like who is in the room, the gender representation, the age dynamics, and the immediate rules of the classroom environment, we can actively dismantle the external structures that impose this anxiety today, rather than, waiting for centuries of cultural heritage to slowly shift.
It is a profound question, and one that requires continued exploration by educators and professionals alike.
We really want to thank you for joining us for this special debate. We highly encourage our listeners to subscribe to Pod Accounting for more deep dives into the science, the sociology, and the daily reality of the accounting profession.
Absolutely. Subscribing to Pod Accounting is the best way to keep these vital conversations going. And we really want to hear from you. Share your own experiences with communication apprehension in your accounting classes or your careers.
Please do.
Drop a comment or reach out on social media. Do you feel your anxiety is driven by deeply ingrained cultural norms regarding authority? Or is it triggered by the immediate practical dynamics of your specific workplace? Also, we highly encourage you to seek out the 2023 paper for yourself, A Cultural Approach to Oral Communication Apprehension by Accounting Students in Brazil and Portugal. Explore the rich data and the methodologies to see where you land on the debate.
Think back to that perfectly balanced spreadsheet we talked about at the very beginning of the show. The math is clean, it's contained, but the moment you open your mouth to explain it to someone else, you step into the complex, murky waters of human culture and society. The numbers may be absolute, but the voice that speaks them is always shaped by the world around it. Thank you for listening.